most of you know me. I think almost everyone does. My name is Sandra Shovelin, and I'm the Vernon and Minni Lynch professor at ICAR. And for several years now, I've had the pleasure of organizing these annual lectures. It's in honor of a very special family, one that's been kind to ICAR over almost 20 years. It has an endowed chair, a stunning piece of property called Point of View, that most of us have been to, and a vision. And in that vision, designed a way in which we can guarantee that the faculty, the students, members of the university at large, and the field at large can continue to grow by having an annual lecture series where we bring in people from outside to inform us of their experiences and then let us fuss with what that means for the field. Your program that's on the chair talks about the Lynch lecture series. I think it's on the back side of that, and some of our previous lectures. In the spirit of what we teach our students, I've used our community's extended social networks to land the perfect people in order to spend an evening with us. A childhood friend and a friend of my family, a friend of mine and a childhood friend of him, Carlos Slutsky, was able to get out of his Argentinian mafia, Luis Moreno Ocampo. He was the first, and still is, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We had a fascinating evening with him, considering the issues involved with the ICC, especially choices that America has made around that, and all the lessons from the field that he was willing to share with us. The next year, Andrew Mack, the director of Human Security Report, he dazzled us with more research data than we could actually handle for the evening, and engaged us in a very lively discussion about the impact of such organizations as the United Nations. The U.S. House of Representatives for nearly 4 decades, Lee Hamilton, vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, and president of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, spoke to us about the 9/11 issues in particular, and what we do and how we do it not so well when we frame others as unacceptable. Well, since then, we've had quite a roller coaster ride. We have in place a new administration in the United States with much hope and many expectations. Yet the economies around the world are in trouble. Though there might be light at the end of the tunnel around Iraq, there certainly is a darkness lurking in Afghanistan as it escalates. Civil wars are continuing, and reconstructions are slow and deeply uneven. Our plan this evening is to hear from another giant in the field, the Honorable Ambassador Jan Eliasson, who has demonstrated over many decades the role of diplomacy all over the world. We thought of him originally thinking about his experience with Darfur, but as we proposed a topic for him, he suggested that he talk about the U.S. and European alliances. He has this evening convinced me that it's quite okay for you to ask about questions on almost any continent, since he's worked across the continents. And so as you're listening to him, I hope you'll be thinking about questions that would pertinent to your own research and study. Regardless, it seems obvious to me that this is the man we need to be talking to this evening, and this is exactly the time we need to be doing that. Following Ambassador Eliasson's presentation, students from 2 academic programs, the master's and the undergraduate, are going to join me in the semicircle. Imagine this is sort of a semicircle, to interview him. And we will then open up, after about 20 minutes of our interviews, to the audience at large. As I mentioned earlier, social networking seems to work. This year, I accessed one of my favorite of many PhD candidates who knew Ambassador Eliasson and was able to convince him to spend the evening with us. I've asked Michael Schenk to give a more formal introduction, but let me tell you a moment about Michael. Michael's in our doctoral program. Currently, he is a communications director for U.S. Congressman Mike Honda from the 15th District of California. Until January, 2009, though, he was our communications director at our institute. He advised us on a number of things, but mostly on strategic and policy initiatives related to domestic and international conflicts. And it's because of Michael that I can't read the newspaper without wanting to write a letter of recommendation. I mean, sorry, a letter to the editor to give my 2 bits worth on this. Interestingly, they usually don't get published. Michael has a decade-long track record working as an analyst advisor to the United Nations, to both government and non-governmental representatives in the Middle East, the South, Southeast Asia, and the US, on many topics including energy, environmental, and security policies. As a doctoral student, he's been intentional about writing regularly in many of the newspapers, the Financial Times, the Guardian, the Hill, and the International Herald Tribune. He's a frequent on-air analyst for CTV News, Al Jazeera, Air America, and Voice of America. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Michael, who will tell us more specific information about Ambassador Eliasson and our 2009 Lynch lecture. And if he leaves some out, I'm going to put it in.
It's good to see everyone. I will first start out with an informal introduction because I think it's relevant, particularly to the students in the room. And it's good to be here again with Icarites. I love the Hill, and I hope you exploit me to your fullest extent on any policy or media initiatives. I just want to offer up my services in that regard. Jan Eliasson, actually, when he was president of the UN General Assembly several years ago, was stuck with the poor task, perhaps the overwhelming task, of managing US-UN relations, which were on the rocks. Ambassador Bolton was doing anything he could to undermine the UN. And at that time, one of the things that Jan Eliasson was doing, he was down here, being the diplomat that he is, trying to curry favor for some of the reform efforts, one of which was the transition from the Human Rights Commission to the Human Rights Council. And I happened to be doing a paper, more of a research project for Nadim Rouhana, who's no longer at ICAR, but at the time was doing a research project on US-UN relations. So I was interviewing anyone I could, and I knew that Jan Eliasson was going to speak at the Wilson Center. And so I went, and it was a small roundtable with the ambassador and his chef de cabinet, Ambassador Vide, who was also there. And I, raised my hand and I said, I'm Michael Schenk, and I'm a doctoral candidate at George Mason Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. Trying to sound self-important, but I was trying to. I'm doing this analysis on US-UN relations, and I'd really like to interview you, Ambassador, on this intractable, I don't think I used this word, but intractable conflict, something like that. And he was very obliging, and he points me to Ambassador Vide, chef de cabinet. He's like, yes, come up to New York and interview me. And so I was interviewing the US mission to the UN at that time, under Bolton's direction, now under Ambassador Susan Rice's direction. And I was interviewing a bunch of their staff and second and third diplomats there, and got a chance to interview Ambassador Vide at his direction. And while I was up there, it just so happened that that was a day or two before a big vote in the General Assembly on the Human Rights Council. And the US was obstructionist about it. They're like, down with the Human Rights Council, it's a sham, it's no good. And the president at the time, Jan Eliasson, was like, help, help, help. Any contacts you have, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, House International Relations Committee. We're trying to do everything we can to get the US on board this Human Rights Council. Well, I didn't have a whole lot of connections, but I knew that Samantha Power, whom I had interviewed a year before, was now advising then Senator Barack Obama on the Foreign Relations Committee. So, not knowing Samantha's new email address, I used the formula for Senate emails and go down into the basement of the UN on the computers and email this Samantha Power's email address that I was guessing. And she responds 5 minutes later saying, yes, we would be happy to pull together some meetings for Ambassador Vide on behalf of Eliasson and Rochelle Gros, who wrote the Human Rights Council resolution text. So a couple days later, I'm here with Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff, whom I had never met before, and Samantha Power, whom I had met, and Ambassador Vide and Rochelle Gros. And developed some relations with Senate Foreign Relations Committee, House International Relations Committee on behalf of the UN General Assembly at the time. Well, unfortunately, I mean, that tilled some of the intractable ground, didn't fully, but now, thankfully to President Obama and probably Susan Rice, Ambassador Rice, we weren't doing it then, but we are seeking a seat on the Human Rights Council, which is great. But it gave me a good window into Jan's incredible deftness in managing intractable conflicts. At that time, it was US-UN conflict. And after he left the presidency, as you know, he became special rep to Darfur, perhaps the most intractable conflict, one of the most intractable conflicts of our day. And he's had experience in other intractable areas like Iran and Iraq. So he's perfectly suited to talk to us today about a range of his expertise and experiences and insight and wisdom. But the reason I tell this story is that, particularly to students out here, we have in our backyard in Washington, D.C., a gem of opportunities. I just happened to go to a talk where he was, and this moment is possible because a friend of mine, Gillian Frumkin, was like, hey, Jan Eliasson is going to be at Wilson Center talking. And I happened to be doing a research project on US-UN relations. And he happened to say yes, talk to my chef de cabinet. So Washington is waiting for the students out here. Washington is waiting for you. So I hope you, and the professors, I hope you maximize what's in your backyard. For the more formal bio, right here, but he's no stranger to conflict. His talk today about US-EU relations is apropos of Obama's tour, so I think it comes nicely on the heel of that. And at the end of his talk, he's going to talk a little bit about how US and EU can partner to deal with some of the world's intractable conflicts. And we can talk together about that, be that climate, be that Iran. So I hope we can partner together. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, Sandra, for inviting me to this event. I'm very honored to be giving the Lynch lecture, and that you wanted to spend an evening in this room instead of meeting spring outside in Washington, D.C. Your introduction was very gracious. I have a slightly masochistic past. Iran, Iraq, Sudan in different periods, Vernon, a few other trouble spots, Somalia also. And when I was finishing my work as emergency relief coordinator in New York, some of you may have heard that I was introduced after a very, very flattering introduction, beginning of the introduction, but it ended in a way which sort of took the positive side out of it, because the woman in question said, and now let me introduce you Mr. Jan Eliasson. He is responsible for all disasters in the world. That's what I got for my work in Somalia and Sudan. Anyway, great to be here. And I think Michael is absolutely right in pointing to the richness that you have here in Washington in terms of meeting places for discussions on any subject of interest, I would say, both domestic issues but also international. The think tanks along Massachusetts Avenue in particular open very often to the public, offer wonderful possibilities for meeting people, developing your networks, which are important in life, both personally and professionally, but also enriching yourself. And I, as ambassador here for 5 years in Washington, D.C., spent at least one day, one lunch hour a week with the think tank, maybe two. Walked over to discuss Sudan and the climate issue, together with senators and congressmen and journalists and people from the research and university world. So take advantage of that. It's a very good idea. For me, it's coming home. I enjoy very much being here in Washington, D.C., particularly since my daughter is now at Atlantic Council, one of the think tanks to which I just gave some publicity. But it's good to be with you, and I thought I would walk you through a few things, and then we can open up for a more informal discussion on as you said, Eliasson. I thought I would say a few things about the present crisis that is related to the financial world, because it goes deep and could even go deeper in the future, in the near future. And I'd like to relate that to the European-US relationship, not least in view of the opening and the very good start that I think President Obama gave this by his trip to Europe recently. And I include Turkey in Europe also. I would then say a few words about the conflicts, but my Darfur experience more in the details and the negotiation and mediation experience I had, I think I would leave for the question and answer period. So I'll try to structure it this way and spend perhaps 30 minutes on this, if you accept this agenda. Thank you very much. I was thinking of the present crisis, that it's actually a crisis in 3 stages. We are living through now, and just in the midst of it, but also on the way to the second phase. The first phase is a financial crisis. The subprime, I was about to say it's a subcrime crisis. And its ramifications in the financial community. The second phase of that crisis is the economic recession and the unemployment that comes from that. The reduction of production. You see it particularly in the automobile industry. Some Swedes regret that Saab is a part of General Motors, but it's too late to say anything about that. Volvo is, by the way, owned by Ford, which many people do not know. We hope this crisis doesn't reach Ford also. But that is the second phase, and we are in the midst of it. And we will probably see more of that crisis, the economic recession and the unemployment. But the third stage, I think we must be aware of, because it could come rather dramatically, and that is the economic, social, and political costs that could come from this crisis. We've even seen it in our own neighborhood. The government was more or less chased out of the government offices in the Nordic countries. Iceland had been carrying on an irresponsible policy of borrowing and borrows 9 times its own GNP. And when then the crisis struck Iceland, Iceland is now completely impoverished, and the government had to go, more or less chased out. We have very deep crisis in Latvia. We have crisis in several Eastern European countries. Not to speak about the crisis that is brewing in many developing countries, where you see still very high food prices. And of course, the slowly, and perhaps in some cases quickly, the economic impact of this global crisis is felt. So here we have 3 stages: the financial crisis, the economic recession, and the possible social and political crisis that could follow from continued negative development. So I think we should be aware of this. We may be in phase 2, basically. And the question is whether we will avoid phase 3. The reason I say this is that I think in the debate, both from our side of the Atlantic in Europe and perhaps here, there's been so much emphasis on how to handle the present crisis, the urgent crisis. You remember the discussion of stimulus packages, whether it should be tax reductions, reduction of taxes, or stimulation of public works, and so forth. I find that discussion, of course, very important, because it has to do with how we deal with the present crisis. But I think it's equally important that we now also talk about lessons to be learned. Because if this financial crisis leads us to act like a truck company picking up a car that has run off the road and then put it back on the road and then go the same way as we've done before, running the risk of not drawing any lessons from this, then I think we would make a serious mistake. But I think therefore we need to have a more thorough discussion on lessons learned already at this stage, when we are in the midst of it. I'm not the one to say which these lessons are. You may think about this yourself, but I would just suggest a few of them. One of them is that we have national regulations which haven't lived up to, neither in this country nor in Europe, for the banking system. What is more natural in the day and age of globalization than that we have an international regulation system that is being respected, and where you have possibilities of sanctions, and stopping Iceland from borrowing 9 times their own GDP. Secondly, how about thinking more in terms of long-term effects of what you're doing? The last 20 years, in my view, have been a period where we have been always practically rewarding the short term. Ask any CEO about the pressures that he or she felt about producing a 20% growth rate or profit growth. Otherwise, the shares would go down. You have these enormous profits, and still sometimes the shares go down. I don't know whether you have seen that yourself or heard from your parents swear about that. Well, that's very serious, that if a company can only think in quarterly terms and not see that it is rewarding to do an investment which is working on 4 to 5 years. Let's look at the whole area of environment, for instance. Or a politician, I was briefly Foreign Minister of Sweden, to think of an action that is necessary to do because it will be important for the next generation, or for 3 or 4 years from now. That doesn't work at all, because you have to think about the next election. So I think that's lesson number 2. How about some more long-term reward? Long-term thinking, a reward for long-term thinking. Thirdly, why not use this for really a very serious ethical renaissance? Or bring out the ethics of what the effects are, what we're doing. That in the private sector you have a responsibility for human rights, you have a responsibility for the environment, you have a responsibility for decent labor legislation, matters like that. Absolutely crucial that that is being brought out, and that we do not forget the 7 deadly sins. I would particularly point at the one called greed. And then, of course, lastly, interdependence. In Europe, we were so relaxed about this crisis when the subprime, I said it correctly, the subprime crisis erupted, because we said, oh, this is an American problem, it's not a European problem. Our banks are in good shape. We don't have the same problem. We don't have these strange loan systems and derivative system and hedge funds. We have them, but not to the extent that's here in the States. But I thought to myself, how stupid it was. Of course, this is a domino game. When this interdependence starts to work, we will all fall. It doesn't matter whether you're a well-behaved or a well-run company. You will also be hit. We will also be hit. And so we were. And this is what globalization is all about now. The interdependence. And it's very important now that interdependence and globalization does not become a negative factor. We could easily have a world where globalization and interdependence, international cooperation indeed, could be seen by some as a problem. People would say, oh, this is crime comes from outside, diseases come from outside, the environmental damage comes from someone else, jobs disappear to another country, let's instead build walls or divide humanity into us and them. We will build our own little kingdom within our own borders. That's very easy, to go that road, so you protest, stop the world, I want to get off. Wasn't that the name of a musical or something? But you have that reaction, rather than, listen, we are in this together. We are either swimming together or we sink together. And if the welfare for another actor, another part of the world, is also the welfare for us. That is this philosophy that we have to reach. I would go as far as to say that we should strive for a world where good international cooperation becomes a national interest. That good international cooperation becomes a national interest. And that in fact there is no contradiction between good internationalism and working for your own country. A friend of mine expressed this in a rather paradoxical way. He said, I'm an internationalist, that's why I love my country. Because that's how you best serve your country, by developing good internationalism. So that's why this crisis now should be used. Let's look at this group where so many of you are young and will run the next part of the relay with the baton. That you draw some lessons and that you do it better than we did, or we are doing. And here, of course, I come to the European-American relationship, because that relationship is, of course, extremely important for the world. I would say that we face three scenarios now. One is, the best one is effective multilateralism, effective international cooperation. The second one is a multipolar world, where the major actors of the world now, let's call them the G20, who met in London, develop the rules of the game. It's good that they cooperate, but remember there are 172 other member states of the United Nations who are not at the meeting of the G20. And the third scenario is what I would call the horror scenario, the fortress world, where we build walls. I saw, by the way, one wall when I was in San Diego and traveled 20 minutes south to Mexico. But where we see walls come up and where we identify the outside as the problem, and where protectionism comes in as the rule of the day, and you protect your own interests, but in a very short-term way. And where there are also very great political dangers, because when you identify people as us and them, it's very easy to see them as, to demonize them if the situation gets very serious. And I've seen enough of that in the world, not least in Darfur. So here are the three scenarios, and I think we have a responsibility, Europe and US, at this stage when we have such a promising possibility with the new president so clearly making the case of good international cooperation. And where Europe hopefully has a tendency and has a possibility to go for soft power, to show that we need to develop our societies as models, and that is how we exert influence rather than through military means. That is a historic possibility to strengthen the number one scenario, effective multilateralism. Possibly with a little sprinkling of good multipolar system, because I think that is necessary too. But we definitely have to do everything we can to fight this fortress world that could occur if the going gets rough soon, in the next few months or years.